Liz, can you hear me? Daniel, can you hear me?
Hear you.
We can hear you.
We are having some trouble getting additional folks on. They're being told the Zoom is full. It appears to have something to do with the magic number of 100 guests.
That is correct. Zoom only lets 100 people join.
Hey.
Are we still muted?
Go ahead.
Taylor?
No, we're not muted.
Dr. Butler, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. To the participants that are out zooming in, if you will, just a couple of things just to address that. To the presenter or to the guests that are in the room, if you will log off,
Okay.
you really do not need to be in the Zoom. That will open up some spots because we have the televisions synced for you and you have notes, a note handout in front of you. So to those that are zooming in, if you are watching as a staff, if you will just log in as a building, if possible, that would also help open up some spots. And I want to the people that are zooming in to know if you are looking for any of the materials that we're using today, your principal has a copy of those, your instructional coach also has a copy of those. So if at any time you would like access, if you would email any of those people, that would help you to get access to the documents that you'll see on the Zoom today. You'll see the PowerPoint. I just want the people that are zooming in to be mindful that this training is designed for brand new teachers. That's why they are present with us today, along with their mentors and their coaches. And I hope that if you are watching today, you too have a processing partner, because BIST really works best if you jump in and kind of get your hands dirty. If you sit back and don't interact and don't practice the language, it's very hard to make it a part of you. So as we're going to have processing time today, I hope that you also have that. But there are a few housekeeping items that I want to mention. I'm a hospitable person, I truly am, but what I'm about to say is not going to sound very hospitable, so I just want you to hear me out. The first thing, normally when we have a presentation this large, obviously people can unmute, they can ask questions, there's a chat that's ongoing. But what I need you to think of if you're zooming in today is you're really auditing this course. You're just listening in. The training and the outcomes are designed for the people in this room because they have a set of criteria to get certified by the state that we need to meet. So all of those outcomes have already been predetermined, and everything that we do is directed at that goal. So what would help us is if you will keep yourself muted and not interrupt the presenter, just allow her to present. The chat is open, but I will tell you we are not going to monitor it, and it's not going to drive the presentation, and that's for two reasons. One, as I've already said, it's because the training is designed to meet the criteria that we need to get accomplished today. But two, and most importantly, and really why most of you are zooming in, there's a great feature that Rebecca, who I'm going to introduce in just a second, has incorporated into the training, and that is the virtual classroom management component. If we stop for every question and allow the chat to guide our presentation, we will not get to that point. And there isn't anyone that wants to miss that. So that's the reason for just letting you know we need you to stay muted if you're zooming in, and just know at breaks we can look at the chat. You're always welcome to email a coach, but when we stop for processing time, know that the coaches are not going to be by email either. They're going to be processing with the participants in the room. But we do welcome you. We're glad that you're joining us. I'm super excited to introduce to you our presenter today. She's a phenomenal presenter, very knowledgeable, and has really worked to meet the needs of our district. As you all know, we keep saying this is a presentation designed for first-year teachers, but I don't think that there's an educator out there who really does not feel a little bit like a first-year teacher, because we are starting the school year in a way that none of us have ever started. And so that virtual classroom management component is something that Rebecca's worked really hard to incorporate, and hopefully you will find that very beneficial. So without further ado, I want to introduce Rebecca. Go.
Thank you, Daniel. This is I'm not off to a very good start because my clicker's not working, so that's okay though. We'll figure that out. Taylor, you may have to click for me for a minute.
Okay.
Hey guys, glad to be here. Glad you're here. I just want to start by saying I'm really sorry that you're starting teaching during a pandemic. I mean, who knew, right? We didn't know this was going to happen. So I think Daniel's right. Anyone in teaching right now has a little bit of a heightened level of anxiety. Realistically, we all do. I have a 12-year-old daughter at home who all of a sudden is having panic attacks. Like, who knew? And so I say that not to be a downer, but just to say, let's be realistic about what's happening, this year. And as kids come in to our classrooms, we're going to have a lot of that. And as they come into virtual classrooms, we're going to have a lot of that. And so I'm hoping that the next few hours is going to be helpful to new teachers, but also to people who have been teaching for a really, really long time, because we all need to kind of rethink some of the things that we've learned. And so I want to start this morning. If Taylor, can you click that? Are you able to?
Mm-hmm.
You may have to see if we have a battery or something. Oh. I think I'm working now. Okay, awesome. Well, hopefully it'll keep working. So I want to start this morning with a little bit of reflection time. And so here's the questions I want you to think about. What are you most concerned or nervous about as we begin the school year? Question number one. Question number two, what are some steps you can take to be kind to yourself so that you can show up for your students and for your colleagues? It's important. It's always important. It's especially important this year. And then that last one, what is your teacher superpower? So I want you to take a couple of minutes and think about that and talk to your processing partner. Turn if you need to, and I'll give you a couple of minutes and then I'll have you share a little bit on that.
Taylor, you'll mute on that for a second. Okay, so
Yeah.
What happened?
Everybody loves saying it looks like.
Quickly today, and honestly, I'm probably going to leave you with a lot of questions, and you're going to want to come back to them later because we have a lot that we're trying to cover, and I know a lot of people are trying to get to that virtual learning stuff at the end. So I probably won't give you quite as much time as I normally would to reflect on some things, but talk to me about, first of all, I just want to ask, what is your teacher superpower? Somebody just yell that out.
Time management.
Okay, time management?
Flexibility.
Flexibility.
Staying calm.
Staying calm.
Being organized.
Love. Being organized.
Consistency.
Consistency. Multitasking. Any others that came to mind?
Loving kids.
Loving kids. Anything else? Okay, teachers are the most versatile, and we've talked a lot as a BIST team about the fact that when the world was falling apart, educators were the ones who went, okay, let's just turn on a dime and figure this out. And so I think those superpowers have come into great play over the last 6 months. So let's talk, Taylor, can you put, let's talk for a minute about the BIST philosophy. I can't come into any place and not talk about the BIST philosophy. We're going to talk a lot about management. Management and BIST are not the same thing. You can't do BIST if you don't have good classroom management. But I want to talk about where BIST comes from and what the philosophy is. And so BIST is a philosophy, not a system. And what that means is there's a lot of great things out there in the area of behavior management, but the majority of them are systems. So if this happens, we do this. What makes BIST different and what makes it stand the test of time is that we always go back to a philosophy. We always go back to our why. So it's a model of teaching and protecting. And what that means is I'm going to figure out how to help you manage the things you can't manage, and then I'm going to teach you how to manage them, just like we do in math or science or anything else. And we do it through grace and accountability. So grace is the relationship piece. How do I stay in the relationship? How do I give you what you need? And accountability is, how do I problem solve with you? And so the beautiful thing is that it's equitable if it's implemented correctly. It works for all students if it's implemented correctly, and it's fair and it's kind. And so I'm really excited to be working with schools this year because if we stay within the philosophy of BIST, we can't go wrong. All right, so moving forward a little bit, what I want to do is I want to talk about the anatomy of a relationship. So there's actually 3 steps to how a relationship is built. And the first one of those steps is boundaries. Often when you think about relationships, you think the visual is this connection and fun and things like that. But the reality, that's not the first step to building a relationship. The first step is boundaries, clear boundaries. And so as students come into your classroom, make sure that you're thinking about, before I can connect, I have to set a boundary. And then the second step to a relationship is connections. And so we have to be thinking about, how do we connect individually with students, but also how do we connect as a community? And so I'm going to give you some time in a minute to think about that. And then the last thing is predictability. That's the last step. And so predictability means it's always, when this happens, it's always going to look like this. That means I'm always going to let you know when you're out of bounds because you're worthy of success. So boundaries, connection, predictability. And so what I want you to do, sorry guys, got myself a clicker. See if we can do
Arrow
that.
down, the arrow down. There you go.
Ah, that's the wrong way.
Oh.
We're gonna get this together here.
That's your next slide.
Okay.
According to the printout.
Perfect. Okay,
Are we good?
we're good.
Okay.
So what I want you to do is I want you to take a few minutes to talk about these things. What boundaries do you need to plan for as students return? Second, how will you make connections both individually and as a community with your class? And I'm asking you to do really hard work because I'm asking for you to think on 2 levels today, in person and virtual. It's hard, I mean, that's a lot, it's a lot for the brain, but we don't have a choice right now. So I want you to think about what that would look like in person, and also what would that look like if you're virtual. And then the last one, how are you going to assess your own ability to be predictable? Because I think that's the hardest thing. How am I going to know if I'm being predictable or not? So let's take a few minutes and have you talk about that.
Starts with the purple reaction. Okay, purple, so. My bad. And that red one up there, can you use that and you, yeah. Dump that, baby. I mean, just set it down. So did you put, Miss McAfee, did you put like a thing in his name?
Talking about boundaries and structure, what are some things that come to your mind? And I'm gonna take 5 things. What are some things that came to your mind? And they may be different than you would have thought they would have been based on circumstances. What's something you need to plan for?
Virtual norms.
Virtual norms. Well,
Try to navigate the classroom, that's, in person or, through digital classroom. Then what it looks like, here's where I put this, here's where I put that.
awesome. How to navigate the classroom, whether it's digital or whether it's in person. Basically, where is everything?
Right.
What else?
Explaining the why of expectations.
Okay, the why of expectations, awesome. 2 more.
Modeling behaviors.
Okay, modeling behavior. Anything else? Okay, so let's talk about connections. We're talking about connections on 2 different levels. Well, actually a lot of levels. So we're going to talk about in person. We're also going to talk about virtual. Then we're also talking about how do I connect to a student one-on-one, and how do I connect my community with me and to each other. So that's a lot of pretty broad thinking. I would say you're going to have to work really hard, and I'm going to give you an opportunity in a minute to kind of think through that one a little bit more, about how do I be really intentional about those connections if you're virtual. It's probably going to take a little more planning even than it does on site. And then that last one, predictability. I want to give you kind of, and if you're taking notes, you might want to write these questions down here in a minute. But I'm going to encourage you that about 4 weeks into the school year, you do what we call a predictability chart, and it's super simple. Let me tell you how you do that. So basically, you just take your class list, and if you're secondary, just choose maybe 1 hour of the day. If you're elementary, you can also choose 1 hour of the day or 1 subject of the day, and take your class list, and every time you redirect a student, tally. Okay? So you're just going to tally when you redirect. I'm not asking you to do it for like a week, just 1 hour, 1 day. Okay? Then I want you to look back on that, and let me give you some questions that you can ask around it. Okay? Question number 1, if you're writing down, what students am I redirecting frequently? What students am I redirecting frequently? Okay, question number 2. What hour of the day, or what part of the hour, am I too loose? That'll help you assess your structures. How do I tighten up? Next question you can ask, what is the gender and what is the race of the students that I'm redirecting? And the last question, what did I learn from this? That's a challenge for you really to take the time to do that, because I think what it will do is it'll help you figure out, am I predictable? And am I predictable with all students? And so that's just one activity that can help you to be predictable. Okay, so I want to go back to those connections for just a second. Talked about the importance of that. And I'm going to give you a few minutes to just talk through, how am I going to learn more about my students as individuals rather than just as students? That's one of those things that can help you with connection, to have conversations that are outside of just school. Also, it's going to help you to have some conversations that are outside of behavior if you have a kiddo who struggles with behavior. Because sometimes we need to be talking to those kiddos about something other than their behavior. And what happens often is that as you get into the school year, if you have a kiddo that's really struggling, everything that we talk about ends up being about their behavior. And so then it becomes adversarial relationship. So think through what's a tool or something you can do to help you learn about your students. And I'll give you just maybe 2 or 3 minutes to work on that. A lot of time to get started today. One more minute and then I'll tell you that. Let's talk about, all right, guys. So what came up in your conversations? Tell me something that came up in your conversations when you were talking about connections and creating some kind of tool. What are the things that came up?
We said, I think that it's kind of an important tool for looking for the positive in the situation we're in, is that in a case like this, we love the mute button. We think that mute would be great in person classes, but that it'll be an opportunity for those kids that, especially at high school level, because we have a lot of students that get lost in the cracks, that you'll be able to really, those kids that are shyer and usually don't participate will be easier to catch. So that's,
Love that. Awesome. What else came up in your conversations? What else came up in your conversations?
We just talked about some of the tools we use, like the interest inventories and things like that. And you can kind of incorporate a learning inventory there too, but it just tells you a lot. If on a learning inventory setting, you say, oh, what's your favorite book? And they say none, or I don't know. Like that tells you a lot right there about something you need to know about that kid, not just academically, but emotionally also probably. So
I love that. And really, it doesn't have to be complicated. Making connections with kids does not have to be complicated. Just noticing is important. If you can just say the words, hey, I noticed this, that's an instant connection with the kiddo, because then they feel seen. And we want to feel seen, correct? We all want to feel seen. And so that's such an important thing. And I think sometimes in the hubbub of everything we have going on and all the things that we need to do, we try to make it complicated when really it can just be simple. So I want you to keep that in your mind and be thinking about it. How can I notice? What can I find out that's going to help me make those connections individually? Did anyone have any conversation, and you may not have yet, but did anybody have a conversation about that community connection? How am I going to connect kids to one another? Especially whether we're virtually or on site. Was any thoughts come up about that? I feel like I heard somebody say something about class meetings.
We I talked about morning meetings. In student teaching, I would always have like the morning question, and I always kind of guided it so that I could figure out different interests. So then I could have more conversations about each individual at a different opportunity, whether it was during reading conferences and suggesting books based on their interests, or even at recess, but we're not gonna have recess right now.
That's great. And what's wonderful is you did two things at one time. So if you're doing that during your morning meeting, you're doing some class connections, community connections, and also learning some things you need for those individual connections as well.
Just for our presenters, could you, as they give you an answer, could you just paraphrase it for the people that are?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you, Daniel.
Sure.
Okay, so let's move on to classroom management. I want to talk for a second about this, what we call the pyramid of success, because everything in education has to have a triangle. So of course this has one as well, right? And so when you're going into a school and you're thinking about how do we basically minimize chaos so that teaching and learning can take place? There's kind of three areas where you do that. So the bottom area, the first thing you have to think through, excuse me, is your common area expectations. And so if you're a new teacher, or if you are an experienced teacher and now we're living in a pandemic and everything's different and everything is new, you have to be really sure that you know what the common area expectations in your building are, okay? Now, you're not on site right now, but we're gonna be sometime, right? We get to go back on site at some point. So common area expectations are important. That's things like hallways, restrooms, lunch, arrival, dismissal, things like that. It's really important that everybody does that the same way. Because remember we talked about predictability was important with developing relationships. Kids that come from chaos, they don't think sequentially. They need you to be the predictable person in their life. And so common area expectations should be the same everywhere, and all teachers should follow those. And I'm going to say something, even if you don't like the common area expectation, even if it's not what you would choose, we all have to follow it. That increases predictability, and that is your first step to control chaos in the building, okay? The second thing is your classroom management. We're spending a lot of time today talking about classroom management. Your classroom management needs to be consistent. So my management doesn't have to be exactly the same as my colleagues, but my management needs to be the same every single day. Going back to boundaries and predictability, okay? So classroom management, thinking through. Now that doesn't mean you can't change something if it's not working, but if you change it, you have to teach it, introduce it, and then be predictable about it. And then up at the top of that pyramid is the individual strategies. So that's what we, like when people talk about BIST, that's what they're talking about, more supports that are individual towards students. So that's where we go back to that philosophy of what does grace look like for this student? What does accountability look like? How do we protect them from what they can't manage? How do we teach them the skills that they're missing? And that's going to be different based on student needs. The beautiful thing though, is if you have really strong common area expectations and really strong classroom management, that should be a smaller number of students who aren't able to meet the expectations. Okay, so your first two areas are really, really important. So let's just talk classroom management, that middle tier. There's 5 big rocks in classroom management. Number 1, preparation. Number 2, organization. Number 3, expectations. Number 4, procedures and routines. And number 5, presence. And we're going to work through each of those areas a little bit today. Like I said, I'm going to give you time to start thinking, and you're going to keep thinking after you leave, I'm sure. Okay. So that first area, preparation and planning. Basically, that's just something that you have to do in order to be ready for something, okay? So there's 4 areas that you need to plan for. Number 1 is the area of curriculum. You got to do some long-term looking at curriculum, some short-term looking at curriculum. That's why you're working probably with mentors and having scope and sequence and all those things that I don't have to look at anymore now that I do this job. Second one is procedures and routines. Really simple procedures like how do you sharpen a pencil? That's the kind of things you have to be specific about, and we'll give you some time to think through that. Organization, somebody mentioned that earlier as a superpower. Not everybody is organized, but you can learn how to be organized, okay? And then the 4th one is behavior. Now, a lot of times I think when you come out of school, this is the thing that they don't teach you, is how to plan for behavior. And really, it can derail the other 3 things if you don't have a plan for that. All right, so let's talk organization first. So I like to say at my house that there's a place for everything and everything has a place. But if you don't teach, somebody said that earlier, teaching where things are in the classroom, where they go, what space is mine, what space is yours, how do we maneuver through those spaces, then you end up with a little more chaos. And so here are some questions that I'm going to give you some time to think about. What does an organized classroom look and sound like? Which is more conducive to learning? Rows, tables, desks, groups. And we're in a pandemic, so think through that, okay? Should you teach students to be organized? How are you going to teach students to be organized? Because there will be a student that their stuff is everywhere, and they won't naturally be organized. But we can help with that, okay? And then why is it important to have an organized classroom? How much do you share with parents about your organization? And then the last one, how do you share that with parents? Like, how am I going to do that? So let's take about 5 minutes and get started on these questions today. About 1 more minute to finish up that conversation. Let's go ahead and move forward. And I want to talk about that next big rock, expectations, boundaries. This is what I want you to put in your mind. I think this is actually a Brene Brown quote. Clear is kind, unclear is unkind. Clear is kind, unclear is unkind. And so what happens to us sometimes is that we think we're being kind by letting things go here and there. But actually what we're doing is causing confusion. And so it's really important for you to have very clear expectations and boundaries. I'm going to give you an example of what we as the BIST team use as bottom lines. I personally don't think you have to have a lot of other expectations besides these two. The first one, it's never okay to be disruptive. And the second one, it's never okay to be hurtful. And hurtful is physically, verbally, relationally, socially, all emotionally, it all falls under that. And so I want you to think through, what do those things look like virtually? What do they look like in person? It's not okay to be disruptive. It's not okay to be hurtful. And so when you're setting boundaries with kiddos and expectations, I think one great practice is to, maybe if you decide to use these, make a T-chart and have a class conversation, maybe a morning meeting or another time where we just talk through what are some things that would be hurtful and what are some things that would be disruptive. And I realize you're having to do that, maybe with a virtual classroom. It's still not okay to be disruptive or hurtful if it's virtual, right? We're going to be a community that is kind and takes care of one another. So it's never going to be okay for you to say something that's unkind to someone. So those are some really simple expectations and boundaries that you could work on. And then let's move forward. I'll give you a little bit more time to think about what are your personal classroom expectations. Do you have some things outside of that? How do you want kids to feel in your room? How are you going to involve them in establishing those things? I just gave you one example of how you could involve them, is doing that T-chart, hurtful, disruptive, and have them come up with the things that would not be okay. The great thing about that is that you can go back to that once you get to know your class. I always thought I would start the year with that, and then about a month or two in, now I know what these kids do. Because every class is different, right? The combination of kids and how they react to one another. So going back to that and saying, hey, what are some things that have been happening in our group, in our community that are hurtful? What are some things that have been happening that are disruptive? You can add those to the chart or the list or the document that you made. So I'm going to give you a little bit of time. I'm not going to read through all these questions for you because you have them in front of you. But I want you to spend a little bit of time unpacking and talking about expectations. I think it's really important for you to think through, how are you going to teach them? We can't have an expectation and expect kids to meet it if we haven't taught them. Remember, clear is kind, unclear is unkind. So take a few minutes and work through, how are you going to teach? What are your expectations? How are you going to present it to parents? How are you going to share the information? And then we'll come back and I'll have you share out some of the things you came up with. Hey guys, I'm gonna interrupt you for just a minute. If you'll turn and look for 1 second, and then I'm gonna let you go back to this conversation. I want to point out 3 questions that we're gonna discuss in a couple of minutes. I'm gonna give you till about 9:30. Here's the thing, 3 questions I want you to finish your conversation on. The first one is, how will you teach your students about your expectations? So I'm gonna ask you to have some ideas to share out about that. The second question is that one that says identify 5 to 7 ways you can stop a behavior without stopping your teaching. I want you to talk about that one, these last 5 minutes. And then the last one that I want you to talk about is how often are you going to review the information? So those 3 things, I want you to finish this session talking about those, and then I want you to be ready to share back with me on that. Okay, we'll go till about 9:30. Time to have some things to share. So let's talk about some ideas that came up in your discussions about how you're going to teach your expectations. What are some things that came up in conversations, things you've seen, things you've tried? What are you planning for? See this teacher technique I'm using right now? It's called wait time. It doesn't have to be your idea. It can be something you heard someone else say. How are you going to teach your expectations?
Modeling, going through and showing the behaviors.
Okay, so modeling, talk a little more to me.
Modeling, like if we say we're gonna be respectful, then I'm gonna be respectful of them and their, what they have to say, not interrupting them if I accidentally do, apologizing for interrupting them.
So modeling. So, if you mess up, modeling how to clean that up, how to fix it. If I ask you to be respectful, I'm gonna be respectful to you. Great. What else? How will you teach expectations?
I mean, obviously, we've heard a lot, especially this year, about having students help create expectations. That way they feel involved with it and they are, teaching themselves, coming up with the structure themselves.
I love the idea of including children in deciding what those expectations are. You just get so much more ownership if you do that. And so I think that's a switch maybe over it's been a while, but way back when, that we told kids this is the way it is. But it is empowering for you to get to be part of the process.
We talked about how it's important to understand that kids might not know what the definition of an expectation is, just to start right there. And we said that basically it's just the best way to do something.
I love that. Defining what an expectation is, it's the best way to do something. And the why behind it, I think anytime you can give the why do we have these? Because teaching and learning is really important. Because you're important and I want you to be safe and I want this to be a place that you want to come to. That going back to the why is an amazing tool as well. Great. What else? How are you going to teach expectations? Anything else before we move on? I think you can, yep, in the back. Go ahead. Is it Erin?
No, I'm Gina.
Oh,
That's okay.
Gina.
I was gonna, say like, role play, like, so I teach special ed, so this will be my third year having the same kids. So I'm at a comfort level where they could like shoot me a video through Flipgrid and then I could share it. So then that way when a new student moves in or something, or if somebody enrolls, then, hey, we could share the video.
I love that. I'm going to repeat that because we have people listening on Zoom.
Oh.
So having kids, if you have kids that are coming back, have them do a video and then you can share it with new students. Be creative. I love videos. Some people will do PowerPoints and go back to it, have the kids role play or act out. Make it fun, make it feel valuable, make it important to them. And they're going to have a little more buy-in if you do that. Okay, so let's go to 5 to 7 ways. Talk to me about how you can stop a behavior without stopping your teaching.
You could like have a pre-made PowerPoint of like, the expectations, and so when you see that, you put up a slide, just a reminder, like not pointing anything out to anybody, and if it's like a mild, kind of behavior, just popping that up, like, hey, I think we need to review these 3 real quick, and then move on to teaching.
Okay, I love that. So a visual of some kind, whether it's a PowerPoint, a poster, a sign, that you can just pop up and say, hey, I've noticed this, we need to repeat it. Or not repeat it, go over it again. Okay, what else? How can you stop behavior without stopping teaching? Yes.
We talked about proximity like within your classroom, but you can also do that in breakout rooms. You can monitor, like if you have them working on a Google Doc and you notice that some of them are not working, that would be a time to use your proximity and pop into that breakout room.
Okay, wonderful. So using proximity, whether it's virtual, popping into a breakout room, or whether it's on site, this is just proximity. I mean, I'm going to get in someone's face. I know we have to be a little bit careful because, social distancing. What else? Yes.
We talked about if little Susie's acting up on Zoom, then just say, oh, Susie, I can see you have a question. I'll be with you in just a minute. So she doesn't have a question. However, you're kind of, and then in a few minutes, okay, Susie, what was your question? Because normally they're going to be like, oh, I didn't have a question. So,
Any verbal redirect that you can do like that is great, especially if you can do it and just keep on teaching and it's kind and it's not calling out is wonderful. Any other thoughts on that? When I'm asking this question, we're thinking of things like as simple as they're tapping a pencil. All I have to do is go over and pick the pencil up, right? So there's a lot of things that we can do to stop behavior in the moment and keep teaching while we do it. And then I just said, hey, without saying any words, I just said, you're out of bounds, okay? And I'm gonna stop it before you get in trouble. And if anyone else,
I
yes,
had a question. We were kind of brainstorming about using the breakout room as like a safe seat kind of thing. So if they're being really disruptive and totally out of line, can you use a breakout room like that where you just kind of put a student in a room and then once, like maybe if you have a video later on, you can play that and then go to that breakout room while the students are watching a video and like kind of talk to them? Or I don't know, we just were thinking that.
So before I turn the mic back over to Rebecca, I would really like to caution you all to think about breakout rooms in Zoom as empty classrooms in a school building. Okay, that is exactly what they are. A Zoom breakout room is an empty classroom. Let that sink in. Okay, so I love breakout rooms, don't hear me wrong. I love them, just like I love empty classrooms when you're doing group projects. But what do you need to do with an empty classroom before you send kids to it?
okay. So thank you for coming up because I was gonna say, well, let's talk about district to district and person to person, and I would have said the same thing. There are some amazing, amazing tools that you're gonna be able to use virtually. I'm not an expert in that, but there are people who are, and everybody's learning this together. So I think that is great feedback. An empty room, and what do you need in an empty room? An adult, okay? So think through that, and we're gonna do a lot more talk at the end on virtual stuff and hopefully give you a chance to do more brainstorming together, but that's a great question, a great thought. All right, anything else? Any other ways that you can stop behavior without stopping your teaching? I mean, sometimes, and like I said, I'm gonna talk in person, I'm virtual, I'm gonna talk pandemic, not a pandemic. We're gonna think on a lot of levels today. Sometimes you can ask a student to move over here, I can keep talking. Sometimes I can ask a student who's not causing the problem to move over here. I mean, there are certain things that you can do. We have to go through all that because we're living in a different, time right now. But you're not always gonna be living in this time. So let's think through and think on a lot of levels. And then the last one I asked you to think about was, how often do you think you should review the information? What thoughts? What are your thoughts on that?
We talked about at least every morning, just revisiting your norms. And then I know with us, when we've had professional development, we usually do norms first, in the middle, and then at the end. So we talked about how we think you would probably have to revisit them more often virtually than you would in person.
Okay, I think that's some really good thinking. There's a lot of ways to look at this. The comment was probably at least every morning to revisit that, but with virtual learning, maybe more often. I would say you're always talking about those, you're always going back to them. What I encourage you to do, and I can challenge you to do, is put it on your calendar to go back and formally revisit your procedures and routines and expectations. You're gonna decide when that's important. I would say at a minimum once a month, you're gonna wanna go back and revisit them anytime there's a break. You're gonna come back and you're gonna revisit those. But if you don't put it on your calendar, it won't happen. Okay, you're always revisiting them because you're redirecting throughout the day, but I think it needs to be formally revisited. So I encourage you now, as part of your planning, that first big step is to calendar when you're going to do that. If you have a BIST consultant in your building, we have some buildings that every BIST day that's just their reminder that this is the day that we revisit expectations and procedures and routines. Okay, let's move forward. We're gonna move to talking a little bit about procedures and routines. So what's the purpose for having procedures and routines? What does it mean to say we have a procedure for, and what does it take to create a procedure in your classroom, either virtually or on site? So talk about that for a few minutes, and then I'm gonna give you some procedures and routines that I think are gonna be really important for you. Okay, let's talk about procedures and routines for a minute. What do you think the purpose for having procedures and routines is? Why do we have procedures and routines? Consistency, remember, go back to predictability. What else?
I feel like it creates a safety for students, like I know what to do, and so I'm not afraid.
Absolutely, safety. It decreases anxiety. We're gonna have some anxiety, us and students this year, more so. What else? Why have procedures and routines?
Otherwise, you just have chaos.
To control chaos. So teaching and learning can happen, right? We always go back to the most important thing is teaching and learning. And so we've got to control that chaos, and procedures and routines are the roadmap to get that done. So why would I have a routine like that says we have a procedure for sharpening pencils? Because if not, you're going to have chaos. So those kind of routines seem unimportant, but they're really, really important. And so your thinking has to be around what are all those procedures and routines. So let me ask you this question. So if I have a procedure or a routine and I don't address you when you are out of procedure or routine, what have I told you?
That it's not important.
Just said it's not important, right? And if you said it, it's important. It has purpose. It has a reason. And so we're always going to let kids know when they're out of procedure or routine. Here's the why behind that, okay? Because we always want to go back to the why. Because if I can address a student at the procedural level before it becomes behavior, then I've intervened early. And I've kept something from happening. So let me give you an example of that on like the common area. In common areas, there are some buildings we work in, not all, and this isn't, you don't have to have this in your common area, but there are some buildings that one of their common area expectations is that if you have a 2-strap backpack, both straps have to be on your back. Why would we do that? Okay, because when I'm swinging my backpack around and it's hitting my neighbor, now we're at the level of behavior, correct? But if I just have one of my straps off, then an adult can come up to me and say, hey, what's this procedure for your backpack? They can put it back on. And so now we've been able to stop the chaos and we've been able to address it at the procedural level and before it becomes behavior. This is the first level to decrease chaos, is having good procedures and routines. Okay, so let's look at some of these. I want to give you, just keep looking. Okay, so let's talk about, I'll give you some elementary procedures, and then I'll give you a minute or two to add to this list based on the fact that you might be virtual this year, okay? So elementary, here are some just basic procedures that you need to plan for. An arrival procedure. A procedure to line up, line order. What do you think the why behind having line order is? There's no reason to run the line, right? If you know where you're going to be and you can't change it. Another thing that we don't always think about is that also decreases the anxiety about where am I going to go, who am I going to stand by. Those students who are struggling with that, maybe the ones that are feeling lonely, they don't have to worry about that. You've taken that away. And the great thing about structure is it doesn't hurt the kids that don't need the structure. And it helps the ones that need it. And so I think sometimes we're worried that we're too rigid or too structured. Your kiddos are fine that don't need the structure. It's not hurting them, and it's helping the ones that need it. So line order is important. Seating assignment, carpet assignments, when you get to the point you can be on the carpet again. Time transitions, end of day and cleanup, always chaos, the end of the day. Part of it, because we're tired. I remember that feeling being in the classroom. I'm worn out by the end of the day. have to have a really strong procedure for the end of the day and cleanup. And then TAPS, and I'll talk about a couple of these before we move on to secondary. So, time transitions. If you're taking notes, you might write down these things. Transitions are the time in the classroom where most of us, where time is wasted, basically, okay? And so we want to reclaim some of that time that we lose in the classroom. So when you're planning your transitions, this is something for you to think through. You need to have an exact starting point. Now that might be when I say freeze, when I say go, it might be 1, 2, 3, whatever your style is, but you need an exact, or when the music starts, but whatever your idea is for time transition, exact starting point. Kids need to know exactly how much time they have for the transition. There needs to be an exact stopping point when the music goes off. Sitting taps, everybody in the room, and I'll talk about taps in a minute. And then they also need to know what's going to happen if you don't meet the transition, okay? That's the thing we forget to plan for. We forget to plan for what do we do if you don't meet the transition. And if you set a transition time and the same person doesn't meet it time after time after time again, and we don't address it, that they're out of bounds and that they're not meeting it, then we're telling them that the time frame doesn't matter. And that's what happens when we end up losing a lot of time. Now, if that happens once, guys, if that happens once, and I can say, hey, come on, you're late, that's fine. But if it happens over and over and over, then we've got to have a plan for that, for what to do if they don't meet it. TAPS. Is there anybody that uses TAPS in their classroom or has heard of it? Okay. Oh, yes. Okay. So we teach TAPS. There's nothing magical about the word TAPS. It just means total and perfect silence. And so I would teach it at the elementary level. We have high schools that use TAPS, truthfully. It just, the way you teach it is a little bit different with a high schooler versus an elementary kid. TAPS just means that we're gonna be able to calm our body and be in charge of our movements, our sound, our mouth. And so basically you can come up, I would just say come up with a way to teach that that's creative and that works for you. Hey, I'm gonna put this acronym on the board, TAPS, what do you think T stands for? You can do it however you want. TAPS is great for a couple of reasons. One, our kids don't know how to be in control of their body, and they don't know how to calm their bodies. And so you can even use this virtually, but it will help them in order to be able to do that. It also gives you an opportunity to breathe if you need to breathe, because you're gonna need to. So it gives you that opportunity. Sometimes it gives you a second to think through what's coming next. The last year that I was in the classroom, I used TAPS every single time we entered back into the room. And so what that looked like is, if we went to PE and we came back into the classroom, my kids knew they went straight to their desks, put their heads down, and they were totally and perfectly silent. Now you have to teach what silent means. Like, that's not silent, right? Tapping is not silent. I say little kids, close their eyes, put their head down. You wouldn't necessarily do that with a middle schooler. Middle school, you might teach, focus on a spot in the room, but we all need some help in that area. That's part of mindfulness. We all need some help in that. So TAPS is a great thing to use. I encourage you to teach that to your students. At the secondary level, here's just some things that we recommend. Room arrival. What's it gonna look like when you get to that hour of the day? Seating assignments. I would say no talking without permission and no out of seat without permission at the secondary level. And then the last one on there, dismissal, not the bell. So you have to kind of figure out what that looks like for you. But if the bell is dismissal and you're not ready for dismissal, there's nothing you can do about it. So decide what your dismissal is, and I recommend it not be the bell. It's when I dismiss you, okay? All right, let's move on. The last big rock in classroom management is your presence. And I think this one is gonna probably be really important this year. I'm finding that, and I'll give you an example of what I think that is in my own life at home. I told you at the beginning that my 12-year-old daughter has developed some panic attacks. And I think she comes from a really stable, nice home with good structure and boundaries. I mean, I think all those things, but her anxiety levels about the unknown of what's happening has led her to have these things. She's always anxious anyway, but it's kind of given her this new, ah. And so I was having a conversation with her a few weeks ago when we were trying to make that decision that parents are having to make about virtual or in person. And I was trying to include her, right? Because she's 12, she's going into 7th grade. So I'm asking her questions. How do you feel about this? How do you feel about this? And what I realized is she can't make that decision right now. And so I thought I was doing the right thing for her by including her. And for some kids, it would have been the right thing. That's the reality. But what she said to me is, I don't know, I just need someone to tell me. And so my reaction as a parent had to be, I got this. You're okay. I'm in charge. I'm going to take care of you. I think our students are going to come back to school this year, and that's what they're going to need from you. They're going to need to know, I've got you. You don't have to worry. I'm going to do my best to keep you safe. Here are the things that are going to be put in place for that to happen. You can't be bad enough to get rid of me. I am here when you want me. I am here when you don't want me. And the last one, you're going to do what I ask you to do where I ask you to do it. That's what present says. Now, we can't always decide how long it takes them to do what we ask them to do. But your presence needs to say, you're going to do what I ask you to do where I ask you to do it. Now, I want you to talk to your colleague for a couple of minutes. Do you feel like you have that presence? Do you feel like when you walk into the room, can you fake it? Right? We may have to do a little bit of faking this year. So talk about what that's going to look like for you and what are some things that you can do in order to set yourself up to have that presence at the beginning of the year. We'll take 2 minutes and then I'll call you back. for about 5 more minutes and then I'm gonna give you a break. And myself one. So what I want to talk about right before we go to break is, because this is on a lot of people's mind, especially for when you do return to the classroom, is reactive measures during COVID. So let me pull this up and then, okay. So I was doing a PD for a school in Chicago a few weeks ago, and we had it all set what we were going to do, and then the principal called me and said, we can't do that. We can't, well, how are we going to do BIST? We can't use safe seats. We can't use buddy rooms, blah, blah. So we reworked things a little bit. And so what I said to her is, I can give you the questions you need to think about. I can tell you the thinking that you need to do. I can't give you the answers on exactly how to do that. And so I'm leaving this today. You're starting virtually. So these are questions that I think schools are going to have to come back to when students start entering the building, okay? So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it today. What I'm going to do is point out a few questions on here, and then we're going to take a break. And if you want to come back during break and talk about this, you can. But I do think this is some thinking that's going to happen when we come back into the classroom. So if you're a new teacher, or if you're a teacher that has been in Grandview before, you're going to have to know the answers to these questions. And you're going to have to, talk about it as a staff. So what's your plan when you have to move a student? Because we don't want to have to move a student during COVID. We don't want to. But if you have to move one, what's the plan? Okay? The next one, are you going to be able to use safe seats in your classroom? And if you are, how are you going to do that safely? I have been in districts where they are not using safe seats. I've been in districts where they're using them, they're sanitizing them in between, they have a plan. Okay, next one. Why would a student need to leave the classroom? Why would they? I would say if teaching and learning can't happen, a student has to leave the classroom. But that's the why, especially during COVID. If I can keep teaching and people are safe, I'm probably going to keep them in the classroom if I can. That's a discussion for your staff at your school, but you're going to have to answer that. If they have to leave the classroom, where will they go? Do we use buddy rooms? Are we not using buddy rooms? If you're not using buddy rooms, how are you going to define the difference between just a BIST movement and an office referral? Okay, so we're talking logistics here that you don't have to figure out today. I'm just giving you the thinking going forward. And what will you set as a time frame for a student when they have to go out of the room? Here's the reason that question came up. When I go into schools and I coach about moving a student out of the classroom, like to a safe seat or a buddy room, and then moving them back, I always coach my buildings, when a student is calm and directable, we move them back. Because the best place to outlast a student is in the safe seat, in the classroom, in the learning environment. So that's always how we move them back. If we're moving kids not through that continuum and we're changing it, then we're going to have some conversations about how long do we leave a student out. And you may have to set some time frames. That's not how I normally coach, but you may have to do that as a staff. So that's something to think about. And then I think this is the thing that we will lose this year if we don't plan for it, is how are we going to provide teachers an opportunity to do that processing and accountability with students? Because I think it's going to get lost if we don't plan for it. So what is that going to look like when we're trying not to move kids and we're trying to keep them in there? So that's the thinking that I think when you move back into the classroom, you're going to have to think through as a building. So like I said, you won't have to do that thinking today, but it's there for when you get back. And if you're new, that's the questions you need to be asking people. What does this look like in my building? How will we do this? Okay, so what I want to do is I want to take a 15-minute break. So let's do, well, about 15 minutes. Let's try to be back at 10:20. Does that sound, can we do that? At 10:20 and we'll get started, okay?
Okay, and then just for our
Okay, let's go ahead and get started because we are on a time crunch here. So what I want you to do right now as people are coming back in is I want you to brainstorm because we talked about the reactive, but really the proactive stuff is what we need to spend our time on, okay? So I want you to brainstorm right now. What are 15 tools that you have in your toolbox before you ever have to move a kid? So before you ever have to move a kid, before you ever have to mute a kid, what are 15 tools that you have in your toolbox? And I'm probably thinking a little more in person with this question, but you can try to think virtually on it too. All right, so take a few minutes and think through that. You try to come up with 15 and then I'm gonna have you share them out. I'm gonna have you share out. Think of some more as we're sharing. What's something you have in your toolbox, and we've talked about some things already today, before you ever have to move a student? Reminders. Proximity. Nonverbal cues. What else? Did somebody say eye contact? I think that was Daniel. Eye contact. Our teacher look may be different under a mask, but you can say a lot with your eyes, right?
I don't think it'll be that different, really. No.
You know?
It's all the eyes.
It is the eyes, isn't it? Like, I always wonder, do people think I look mad and they tell I'm smiling? I mean, I don't know. So, yeah. What else? What else do you have in your toolbox?
Contact home.
Okay, contact home.
What about just a small, like, touch
Yep.
Your presence.
Just your presence, your hand on a shoulder, if you can do that, you know? What else?
I don't know if this has been said, sorry, I was back there. I like to bring attention to like someone presenting the expectation of the proper behavior.
Positive reinforcement for those that are doing things right, yes. What else? Okay, you're probably gonna think of more as we go forward. I'm gonna give you some things that I think you have in your toolbox and need to have in your toolbox as we move forward. So we're gonna talk through them pretty quickly, but I wanna put them in front of you. Staying in the philosophy, strong management, gateway behaviors, early intervention, language to de-escalate, processing, proactive protections, skill-based coaching, frequent emotional check-ins, and class meetings. Now, that's a lot. But you have that in your toolbox. And so I'm going to talk briefly through those things before we move to the virtual session, okay? So first one on there is staying in the philosophy. When I started today, I told you this is a philosophy. Here's why that's so important. It's important because it doesn't matter what our circumstances are. The philosophy holds. It stays. So to be a BIST school right now is a wonderful thing because our philosophy doesn't change because there's a pandemic. So here are the questions that you can ask yourself to make sure that you're staying in the philosophy. What does grace look like for this student? What do they need from me? How do I lean into relationship even if I don't feel like it? How do I make them feel important and worthy of success? How do I make them understand that I'm not going anywhere? Okay? And that's different for every kiddo, but that's the question you ask. Second thing, accountability. Where am I on accountability with this student? There's 5 steps to accountability. Can they even be honest? Do they know they have a problem in their life? Do they see patterns? Can they let me help them? Will they let me problem solve with them? Always asking yourself, where am I on accountability with this kiddo? The next one, what skill do I need to teach them? Like, we're teachers, right? So identify, what are they missing? What do I need to give them a replacement behavior for that's okay? And then how do I protect them while I'm teaching? So what restrictions need to be put in place? So what we want is for kids to be able to manage their behavior on their own, but sometimes we have to manage it for them to stop the acting out and to keep them out of trouble. And so if you're asking those questions when you're dealing with behavior with a kiddo, you're in the BIST philosophy. And there doesn't have to be, if this happens, do this. It's what does that kid need in the moment, okay? So that's the great thing that's in your toolbox is the philosophy. The next thing that's in your toolbox is your classroom management. We talked about that earlier. That's in your toolbox. That's important. That has to be thought of before you ever move a kiddo. So those 5 things are really important. The next thing that's in your your box is what we call the essential 5. So the essential 5 is just, this is kind of what I would suggest doing before every activity. And you can do this whether it's virtually or whether it's in person. This is what you need to let kids know before you start an activity. First of all, what materials are needed, okay? What materials are needed, and if you're taking notes, I would write, and what to do with the things that are not needed. That's gonna be important in virtual, by the way, okay? So materials needed and materials not needed. The next thing you need to let students know is the time allowed. How much time do you have? I am the worst at this when I present with adults. Like, I do not follow practice what I preach. I'll say you have 2 minutes and then 5 minutes later we need to come back. Don't do that with kids. I shouldn't do it with adults either. But if you say 2 minutes and you see that they need 5, stop at 2 minutes and give them more time. But you need to be an adult who says what they mean and means what they say. So time allowed, tell them how much time they have. The next thing that you have to plan for is behavior expectation. That might be voice volume, it might be stay in your seat, it might be work with partner, whatever the behavior expectation is, make sure that you say that before an activity. The next thing is how to ask for help. So if you're stuck, how do you ask for help? It might be raise your hand. It might be ask 3 before me. It might be put a sticky on your desk or a light. However you want them to ask for help, you need to let them know. It's not going to be just come up to me probably. So you have to give them how to get help when they need it. And then the last one is what to do when they're finished early, because that's always when the chaos happens. If they don't know what to do and they're finished, then there's going to be a problem. So what to do when finished is really important. You may think that they should know those things. They don't. So if I said it ahead of time, then I can address them procedurally based on that. So make sure those essential 5, they will save your life. I've got some teachers who have a visual on their board and they go up and write in that visual before each activity, because those things are different based on what you're doing in your classroom each time. Okay, so essential 5 is in your toolbox. Next one on that list is gateway behaviors. If you have been to BIST training, you know what a gateway behavior is. It's just something that we ignore. That's truthfully what it is. We ignore it, and then it ends up becoming a bigger problem. It's usually nonverbal and negative, like eye rolling, flipping hair. My favorite with little kids is I say, hey, can you go over there real quickly? And they go. They walk as slowly as they can. That one always did get me. I did not like that one. And so they seem insignificant, and sometimes we are tempted to ignore them. And what I'm going to tell you is, I don't think pick your battles is the right phrase to adopt. I think pick your timing is important, but not pick your battles. And so let me give you an example of that. We talked earlier about using taps, total and perfect silence in your classroom. So if I've asked my class to do taps when they come in, let's say they're transitioning, and I've said, let's do taps. And 99% of my kids do taps. Do I address the one who doesn't? Or do I go on with teaching and learning? What are your thoughts? Does anybody say go on? I'm going to tell you that if I think it's going to be contagious, I'm going to address it. If I don't think it's going to be contagious, I may not address it right that moment, but I'm going to address it. And so that's what I mean by pick your timing. So if I can go on and teach, I might go on and teach. It depends on the moment. It depends on the student. If I can go on and teach, I might. But like on the way out to recess or on the way somewhere else, I'm going to grab that kiddo and I'm going to say, hey, I noticed you weren't able to do taps with us earlier. I'm going to have you do that right now. So I'm always going to let you know when you're out of bounds. Because if you don't, then your boundaries don't hold. And kids learn really quickly that they don't matter anymore. So pick your battles to pick your timing. Change that phrase out. So gateway behaviors, here's the things you need to teach for that. You need to define it. I don't care if you use the word gateway behaviors. Like, I really don't. That's our word. Some people use it, some people don't, but basically you're teaching this is nonverbal negative communication. It's never going to be okay. Why you're going to address it, how you're going to address the behavior. Here's some language. Your language can be your own. Mine was usually, hey, I don't want you to be in trouble. Can you stop? That's just how I normally redirected kids. And what I taught them, though, is that that's how they would be redirected. And so we had conversations about, when I see you're out of bounds, I'm going to say, hey, are you okay? Or, hey, I don't want you to be in trouble. That should be a signal to your brain when you hear that phrase that you're about to be in trouble and you should stop. So how are they supposed to respond? You should say, I'm okay, and stop the behavior. So you have to teach kids that. Make the language your own. I would come up with a mantra though. I would decide, how do I want to redirect kids? How do I want it to sound? What do I want to do? So be thinking about that. I might give you a minute to talk about that, but let's move forward. Oh, I missed the most important one on there. What are you going to do if they don't respond appropriately? And we'll come back to that in just a second. Okay, next one. Early intervention. is in your toolbox. It is important. I would say to you, be really, really intrusive when you start the year. Because if not, in March, you're gonna be crying and really overwhelmed. So be very intrusive and always redirect when they're out of bounds. I say one verbal redirect and then take action. So that might be, I do proximity, it continues, I give a verbal redirect, and then I'm gonna take action. Earlier, when we talked about all the things you can do before you move a kiddo, like proximity, pick the pencil up, things like that, those are take actions. It doesn't have to be move a kid, but take some kind of action. Stop the behavior when you see it. Don't wait until you feel it. Early intervention, when I walk into schools and everybody's really frustrated, I usually go back to this. Are we intervening early enough before we're mad? Okay, next thing in your toolbox is language to de-escalate. So when you're intervening with a student that's out of bounds, you need to do these 5 things. You need to be quick, kind, calm, firm, and if you can get close, get close. Now, I know, pandemic. That's why I'm saying, think on both levels today, guys. That quick, kind, calm, firm, and close. I can be firm and still be kind. It's never okay to not be kind. I can be kind and firm. So here's our language. You don't have to use this language, but this is the why behind the language. So we may say, we use 3 steps. I see, can you, even though. So that might be, hey, I see you're having a hard time sitting still. Can you stop, even though it's hard? So the why behind those is, I see, I really didn't use that hardly ever. You can, but it's more for kids who are impulsive, because sometimes they do something and they have no idea they're doing it. So they're kicking the chair and making noise, and they don't even know they are. So when I say I see, that kind of re-engages their brain into what's going on. I much more often said, hey, can you stop? I know it's hard. So the can you, we're just inviting them in. We're just giving them the opportunity to make the right choice. And anytime you can do that, you're gonna reduce resistance. And then even though it's just to validate. Hey, I know it's hard. Hey, I know you really have something you wanna say. Can you hold it for a little while? So that language, everything we talk about with language is to reduce let me try that again. To draw kids in, because we want them to partner with us. And we want to reduce anything that helps them to escalate. Okay, so carrying confrontation is in your toolbox. Next one. Next thing on that list is, well, let's talk about, this is still part of that. So let's talk about some predictable responses. Often, when you redirect a student, sometimes they just stop, right? Let's talk about it when they don't. Here's some responses that are very, very predictable. Sometimes they shut down. Sometimes they deny. They say things like, why, what did I do? You're so unfair. Sometimes they blame. They were doing it too. And so I want to give you some language that you can use in those very predictable responses. So if they shut down, I'm just going to say to you, set your limits and follow through. Don't get hung up on how long it takes them. That's where the power struggle comes in. But remember, you're going to do what I ask you to do, where I ask you to do it. And so second one, denial. If a kid's denying, they're saying, why, what did I do? They know what they did. They're just trying to get you to argue with them. They need to understand, we're not going to argue about this. I will talk to you, and I think that's a conversation to have with your kiddos up front is, hey, if you have questions for me, or if you think something's unfair, I'm always going to have a conversation with you, but I'm not going to do it while teaching and learning is happening. So if a kid says, why, what did I do? You can say, great question. You go ahead and move to the safe seat. Now let me give you some language that we came up with the last time I was meeting with the school. They're trying not to move kids. So they were going to change the language to, hey, great question. Can you go ahead and put your head down and take 5? So almost like a safe seat move in their desk. So that's something you might try and see if that works. Great question. Can you go ahead and put your head down and take 5? And then I'm going to walk on and I'm going to teach. And then the last one, he did it too. I'm not the only one. If the student is blaming, validate. I know this is hard. Can you go ahead and move to the safe seat? Or can you go ahead and put your head down and take 5? Something to let them know we're done. We're not gonna have this conversation right now. And then always go back and say, hey, can you trust me? That I'll have a conversation with you, but it's never okay to be disruptive, right? Go back to your bottom lines. It's not okay to be disruptive, so we're not gonna do that when teaching and learning is happening. So that's just some predictable responses that you can put in your toolbox. Okay, next one. We talked a little bit about the importance of processing. Processing is just questions to problem solve. And I'm not gonna spend a lot of time on that, but if you're new to BIST, get your hand on some processing questions and try it out, because that's where, when you're processing and problem solving with a kid after an incident, that's what increases their accountability. And that's just questions. And so the only thing I wanna say to you, for you to really keep in your toolbox, is when you are problem solving with a kiddo, ask questions. Anything you wanna say to a student, because we used to lecture, it doesn't work, they don't care. They don't, I'm sorry, they just don't care. Anytime that you want to lecture a kiddo, and you will want to lecture, we all do. I want to lecture my own kids at home. Turn it into a question. Hey, what was I worried about? Why did I ask you to put your head down? Don't tell, ask. So when you're problem solving, ask questions. Questions are in your toolbox. Okay, next one. Here's 4 questions that you can put in your toolbox to consider when you're planning for a kiddo. This goes back to the philosophy. What does their repeated behavior tell me they can't manage? I don't know, virtually, maybe they can't manage the microphone right now. Maybe that's not something they can manage, and I have to manage it for them. Second one, what restrictions do they need based on what they can't manage? I'm just gonna encourage you, as kids are coming back, we need to be empathetic, but don't use your empathy as a reason to lower your expectations. I'm gonna say that again. Don't let your empathy be a reason to lower your expectations. What it should do is it should cause us to raise our supports so that they can meet the expectations, just like we do academically. We're gonna support you more, but I'm not gonna lower the standards, because if I lower the standards, then I just told you you can't meet them. And nobody wants, that doesn't increase grit, that doesn't increase resilience. Doing something hard is what does that. And so then what skill do I need to teach them, and how am I gonna reduce restrictions once they're in partnership? Those are questions that you're gonna wanna have in your toolbox. They may not mean that much today, but when you start looking at behavior issues, these are the questions you'll come back to. Okay, so I wanna throw these in here. When you're thinking about what, when you're thinking about what skill to teach, here are the 3 life goals that we go back to. They can't experience an uncomfortable or overwhelming feeling without getting in trouble. They can't be okay if someone around them is not okay. That's like peer pressure or retaliation. And then that last one, they can't do something when they don't want to or if it's hard. And that's like rules or adult directives, things like that. So when you're trying to plan for a student around what skill they're missing, this is what you can go back to. I love to do this because I can always just say, well, there's your curriculum. Is that the best curriculum ever? It's like these 3 things, that's it. And so when you're planning, these are the skills that you need to go back to. Almost all of your, well, I would say all your behaviors will fit into one of those. So look beyond the behavior at the missing skill. Look below it. What's underneath it, okay? All right, and then when you're planning for that missing skill, here's the things you have to plan for. And I'll give you an example of this. If you want to write down some of this language, this might be something good for you to have. You've got to plan for timing, exact words, tone of voice, body language, and proximity. So let me give you an example of that. If I have a kiddo that's missing skill number 1, which is having an overwhelming feeling and being okay, then these are the things I plan for. The timing is, hey, when you're feeling angry or when you get upset, that's the timing. It's going to be different for every situation. So it might be when you didn't get breakfast, or it might be when somebody says something you don't like, or it might be when the math is really hard. So see where the timing is? It's when they have a problem. What can you say to let me know you're not okay? I need exact words. What can you say to let me know you're not okay? And then tone of voice, you have to plan for tone of voice. So how should your voice sound? Should it sound calm or should it sound angry? Next thing, thank you. Next thing to plan for is body language. Body language is totally dependent on the kiddo. I mean, it's what you need to see. So if you've got a little one who their fists are up when they're mad, then you might say, well, should your hands be up at your face or should they be at your body? Should your face look calm or should it look stressed? So body language is whatever I want to see that I'm not seeing, I put that into a question. And the proximity is where can you go? What can you do there? How long will you need to calm down? Those kind of questions. So the reason I added that slide in is because as you move into the year and you start to have kids and you're like, oh, they're missing this skill, I want you to be able to go back to this and say, these are the things that I need to plan for them. Because what you're trying to do is replace what's not acceptable with an acceptable response. Okay, so planning for missing skills is in your toolbox. Skill-based coaching is in your toolbox. What I just did was take you through skill-based coaching questions. That's what I just did. Timing, tone of voice, those things. And so skill-based coaching, I would say if you've got kiddos who you know are going to struggle with behavior, put some questions together for them within the first month of school. And then what you can do is, and I know it's harder virtually, and I know we're going to talk through the logistics of that right after I'm finished with this part. But on-site, virtually, if you've got some kids that you know would benefit from early in the morning saying, hey, so if I ask you to do something that's really hard today, how can you let me know? Those questions, skill-based coaching is the best way to teach kids a missing skill. That's in your toolbox. Okay, and then the last one, I think this might be the last one, is classroom prevention. Everyone needs to have a systematic way to check in with their kids. You're gonna have some time today to be thinking through what that looks like virtually. But the purpose is to take the emotional temperature of your students when they come in, because if they're not okay when they get there, it's gonna probably get worse. And so you have to have a plan B for that. There's lots, I mean, you can Google that. There's tons of different ways to do that. It can be elaborate, like the fancy handshakes or whatever, but it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be. But it does need to be systematic so that I have a plan for how I'm going to check on them every single day. I would say maybe more than once a day, especially right now. You may need a morning check-in and a midday check-in to see how they're doing. If you're secondary, maybe it's just at the beginning of the hour. So one thing I want, if you're writing notes, this is the thing I want you to write down. It's about the plan B. So if a student comes in and they're not okay, here's some things that you can offer them. You can offer them time. Hey, do you need some time? How much time do you need? You can offer them space. That's a little bit difficult virtually, but when you get back in the classroom, hey, do you need to go sit over there for a minute? Do you need to go to a buddy room? Do you need to go somewhere else? Or you can offer them, do you need to talk to someone? Those are just 3 things that you can offer as a plan B when you recognize that someone's not okay. One thing that I saw at one point was a teacher would do in class, when you're in person, they had like a vocabulary study on feeling words. So they did the study, it was older kids. And then their job was when they came in the morning to write on the corner of their paper the feeling word, and then she could go in every morning and walk around and check that. And if she saw a word that was, concerning to her, then she could go into, hey, come over here for a minute. What do you need? Do you need some time? Do you need someone to talk to? So that's a great plan. That's just a way to do it. There's lots of different ways to do it. Okay? All right. So let's move. The last one, community building. So what are the big rocks you want your students to feel in your community? We're not going to take time for this because we're going to move forward, but I think class meetings and community building are a very important tool in your toolbox. I would ask you to take the time to decide what are the big rocks in your community? What do I want kids to feel in our community? And then have your community building, your community meetings, go back to that. That's how you have purpose when you're in those meetings, is that whatever I want my community to feel like, my why, that's what I plan my meetings around. Okay, So what I want to do now is we're going to move into the virtual part, which is what people have been really wanting to do. And I want to give a little disclaimer before we start this. I don't have the answers to all these questions. So if you thought that you brought me here and I was going to answer all your questions today, I'm very sorry to disappoint. What I'm finding is that every school district is different. Every platform that every school district is using is different. The amount of time that kids are going to be on the computer is different for every classroom. The systems are different. So what I want to do today is I want to just help you think. That's my role today. I'm going to facilitate the thinking. So as a team, the BIST team came up with, just based on our conversations with schools and different things, the things that we need to be prepared for as far as going into virtual classroom management. So we came up with 9 categories. Category 1, be prepared, be on time, be in quiet place, camera and presentation, the microphone, can you believe we're living in this world? Participation, the chat responsibility, communication, and how to be respectful. And so what I'm going to do is we're going to go through the slides and we're going to take some time on each one of the slides. I'm going to let you have conversations. Now, you won't be done with these conversations today. I know that, I'm sure you know that. But hopefully what you can do is you can start the conversations and then you can take these questions and they'll help you kind of guide your management. So the first category we have is be prepared. This is things like materials, things like making sure your computer's charged, making sure you have the right stuff where you're at. What are you gonna do about food and drink? Is it okay to be eating and drinking during class? I mean, the questions that we're having to think about are unbelievable. So what I want you to do is I want you to take, I'm gonna give you 5 minutes on each one, which is not gonna be much, truthfully, but it will at least get us started. Then afterwards, I'll take a couple of minutes and have you share out some important things that came up in your conversation. Does that make sense? So we'll talk for 5 minutes, then I'll have you share anything that you're like, oh, we came up with this idea, that's great. That way, if somebody else needs it, they get it, and then we'll move to the next set of questions. Does that sound doable? That work? Okay, so let's take some time. I'm not gonna read all 6 questions and have you guys go through each of those 6 questions and kind of start your thinking around them. Be prepared. let me pull you back. Okay, let me pull you back. That was 5 minutes. I know it went fast. So I'm actually going to use a timer, like I said you should. So tell me something that came out of that conversation that you are going to do. Something you figured out or decided based on talking through those questions about being prepared. Not enough time?
I'll share what Kendra said. She's planning on having to be on her Zoom a few minutes early and have a slide. These are the things that you're gonna need to make sure. So if kids log on early, they have a few moments to make sure they have a checklist and they're ready to go when it's time to start the instruction.
Okay, isn't that what we do in the classroom? When they arrive, we have a checklist. A lot of teachers have a checklist of things that need to be done. So the idea that came out was she's gonna be on early with a checklist, a slide of things they need to do so that they can be ready right on time when class starts. Great idea. Any other thoughts?
I just have a thought. So I don't have a classroom, we do speech, so some of this stuff doesn't really apply to us, but I was worried about like the computers running out of juice and that type of stuff, and I was thinking that maybe if like the classroom teachers at the end of the day, part of their dismissal procedure is to make sure your computer's plugged in before we all get off for the day or something like that, and that might help.
Great idea. I'm re-saying these things for the people that are on Zoom, so I know you guys can hear each other. But the idea was, whoever ends the day with the students, whether it's elementary or somewhere else, they actually take the time to say, okay, let's go ahead and make sure we get our computers charged, whatever needs to be ready for the next day, that's done at the end of the day. Great plan. Any other thoughts on that? Yes.
Okay, so I teach SPED, so our SPED team at our building is going to do like, once we get up and running and things.com, but so like if you are in a Zoom, like 80% of the time when you come back in for hybrid or whatever, and then you'll come back with some kind of surprise because we really want to get that attendance piece. So, if somebody's not having their computer charged, then, hey, we want to make sure you get that 80% so you can get that surprise.
Okay, so some kind of reward system based on making sure your computer is charged. Okay. All right, let's move to category 2. So the next category is being on time. This is going to be an issue for sure. So got a lot of people thinking about, am I doing stuff live or am I recording so people can watch it later? I don't know the answers to any of that, but so it is going to be important to teach be on time. So here's your questions to be thinking through around that. We'll take another 5 minutes. If you don't need 5 minutes on be on time, go back to the one that you just talked about. I want you to use the time to just talk through this, try to come up with solutions. So I'll set the timer, give you 5 minutes to work on be on time. Okay. Let me pull you back. So what wonderful problem did you solve? What did you come up with in the category of be on time?
We talked about like if a student is late just once, asking them to like stay back like you would in the classroom and just say, hey, just a reminder, we started this time, we ask that you come on, a little bit ahead of time. And then if it's consistently, then contacting home and finding out what are the barriers that are causing that. Is it that multiple children are trying to get on at the same time in the house? Is it that they didn't have internet access at that point? But just trying to solve the problem through the household as well.
I love that. So if it's once, we're just gonna redirect just like we would anyone else. The BIST motto is always 3 times and we pull you in. So if this has happened 3 times, then I'm probably gonna go to the next step of addressing it with home, with parents. Hey, guys, we're gonna have to be sensitive to the fact that every home is not the same. And there are kids that this is gonna be easy for, and households that this is, I don't think it's gonna be easy for anyone, but much more doable. And then there are gonna be some that this is gonna be really hard. And so we are gonna have to ask those questions. And I love that you were sensitive about it. Like, how can we help? What do you need? What can make this easier for you? Because I promise you, parents are doing the best they can. They are doing the best they can. Now, their can may not be what you would think is best, but there are very few people that aren't out there doing the very best that they can. And we have to be compassionate with parents. We have to be compassionate all the time with parents. But during a pandemic, we got a new level of compassion that we need to reach because they are doing what they can do. And it's just the level of what that looks like is going to be different everywhere. Any other thoughts that came up on be on time?
One thing we talked about up there at the front was just, you may have to really be explicit on what on time actually means. If class is 9 o'clock, that doesn't mean you're logging on at 9 o'clock, and then you're scrambling to find what it is you're supposed to have. It may mean the procedure is if we start at 9, you're on by 8:55, fully set, ready to go. You just, again, in the spring, you can rely on those relationships that you had in place. These are brand new students who don't know anything about you, and vice versa. So you really are gonna have to be explicit so that they start to understand what your expectations are and what that means to be connected to you and your world.
That's great. A conversation just around what does on time mean? It means not that you're plugging your computer in at 9 o'clock. On time means we're ready to go at 9. So you have to set that, you have to decide, and you have to set that up with your students ahead of time. Okay, great thinking. Let's move on, category 3. So category 3, be in a quiet place. Guys, I'm just gonna go back to what we just talked about. A quiet place is it's not gonna be the same for everyone. And coming up with a quiet place in one home may be very, very easy. In another home, that might not be the case. So these questions I think are super important. I wanna point out, I'm not gonna read the questions to you, but one idea that's come up is that number 4, having common virtual background. If you can I can't tell you how to do that, but there is someone in this district that can. And if you can come up with a common background that your kids have and set that up on their computer, you're helping with all kinds of things. We're helping with privacy, we're helping with protection, we're helping it to look equitable. There are so many things that will help with. And so we wanted to just put that idea in there for you because it kept coming up. And then I want you to just take the next 5 minutes. What does a quiet place look like? How do we help kids figure that out? Some of them will have somebody help them figure that out, and others are going to need you to do that. Parents are going to maybe need you to do that. So take the next 5 minutes and talk about category 3, being in a quiet place. Okay, let me pull you back.
And then there's two things like.
So anything that came out of that conversation that you want to share about being a quiet place? Anything about how you're going to help students figure out?
Well, I think one thing we have to keep in mind is that in the past, this was ours to dictate because they were in our environment. Home is home, school is school, and now you have this hybrid of the two where we're really having to morph it. And I was sharing with Kendra and Tyler in the spring, and I had kids that would say, well, this is my quiet space. And the quiet space was they were sitting at the table with their other 4 siblings. And they were told, this is where school takes place, in the kitchen. And that's, I can't leave, Mr. Shear. Okay, so there was a lot of home negotiation of, I know that I'm asking you to alter a home procedure, but I need you to understand this is the reason why. And so there was almost a negotiation with, I had multiple families, that was their procedure. All kids were in one room at the same time, doing everything, siblings helped siblings, and that's how it had to be until you had to negotiate that. And again, offering that why, this is why. We can't hear, and I can't teach math when the 3 siblings are darting in and out and everybody's now focused on that and not the lesson. So, you know, it's just a different shift in thinking for us as well as parents, that now we're kind of negotiating a shared space and what that actually means for everyone.
Well, and because we got off kind of a rocky start this morning, I know I skipped the slide about common goals. You'll see it back there. I think when you're, even in this particular world, when you're talking to parents, go back to those common goals that we have. You know, we want your student to be successful, and so do you, right? This is the why. We want them to have friends, and so do you. I mean, go back to those common goals that both educators and parents share for their kiddos, and that's going to help you have some of those conversations when, like Daniel said, there is some negotiating that we have to figure out and how to make things work. Sometimes just you have already done some of the thinking that parents have not had a chance to do yet. And so that, I think that's great, is keeping in mind that now we're negotiating a space that's not school and home, it's a shared space. And that's gonna be tricky, it really is. Okay, category 4, let's move on. Category 4, camera and presentation. I want you to think through when you're doing this. Whew. Keep in mind, I'm going to say that every single time. Every home is different. So you have to think what is reasonable? All right. So camera and presentation, talk through these things about how do you want them to show up? Clothing, does it matter? Body language, attentive listening. I think teaching, you need to do this in the classroom anyway. What does an active listener look like? I was going to tell you, one of the things that I've had to figure out is my dog does not help me to have a quiet place. Like the pets, like I cannot tell you how many times I have a 1-year-old golden doodle that she's barking at anybody who walks down the street, and I'm in the middle of something like this. I'm like, oh my gosh, I got to think through that. So that was just a random thought that came to my head. So look, think about this. What matters, what doesn't matter, what boundaries are reasonable for you to set with your students? How are you going to talk to parents about that? And I'll give you 5 minutes on camera and presentation.
Could you please define misuse their camera during a lesson?
Thank you, Daniel. Now, I was just thinking I might be that mom. So please
I
protect.
wasn't gonna tell them.
Please protect me from myself. Seriously, I was thinking, gosh, how easy would that be to kind of, as it becomes natural for kids to be in your home doing that? And you're in your home, right? How natural it might be to just kind of forget that you're in the world. Yeah, thank you. I'm gonna work really hard to make sure that does not happen and mortify my 12-year-old. Okay, did anything else come out of that conversation about camera or presentation?
We talked about the importance of maybe asking students to put a wall directly around them, so you avoid
Putting a wall, oh, okay, great idea. Having students sit somewhere where they have a wall behind them. Great idea. Okay, awesome, good thinking going on today. Okay, let's move to category 5, the microphone and mute. I'm probably not gonna give you a full 5 minutes on this one because this has come up before today. We've talked about it already, but let me give you 3 minutes to talk about the microphone and the mute. Like I said, every platform's different, so you guys are gonna have to figure out how the microphone works and what you can do on that. So take 3 minutes and talk about the microphone and the mute.
interviews.
All right, let's get back again. You know, there was a conversation going on up here about, like, adults can't do this, right? We're all trying to figure, oh, thank you. I don't even know why I did that. We're all trying to figure that out, how to use this technology in this way. And I'm gonna encourage you, there's probably some experts in your building that are just really naturally good at this stuff. They might be younger than me. I don't know, maybe they're not, but but hopefully you can identify who those people in your building are and we can help each other. Because what's natural to one educator is not necessarily natural to someone else. So rely on those people that are good at this. I hope, and I don't think anybody's gonna be having any attitude towards someone who's struggling right now, because we're gonna have to help each other. We're just gonna have to. So did anything come out of the conversations around microphones or muting that you wanna share out?
We just discussed that it should be a procedure right out of the gate that you practice and do with students.
Yeah, the comment was it should be a procedure, that you practice it right from the beginning. So when you're putting together your list of procedures to teach, that's one of the things that you probably need to teach. I mean, we're learning even in our team meetings on the BIST team, we've had to learn how to do that stuff. We've had to put procedures in place. So we're having this conversation, everybody's muted. Unmute your microphone if you have, or raise your hand, or I mean, we're doing that as adults, so we've got to figure out how to do that with kids along the way. Yes?
In Canvas, when you're scheduling your Zoom meeting, there is an option to automatically mute anyone that enters the Zoom. And I feel like that's gonna be something I always click, just so that anytime they come in, whether it's late or on time, they're automatically muted. And I would set the expectation that you remain muted unless you have something to say.
Yeah, I think you have to, because we can mute, you can set it to be mute, which is a great idea as a procedure. I think probably you want to set your expectation as you don't unmute without permission. Like there has to be a reason to unmute.
They raise their hand and then you say you can unmute.
You can do, if you're having a conversation back and forth, they could raise their hand just like in a classroom and then unmute. You give them permission or you can unmute them, either way. So that's just some things to, I would suggest if you haven't done this yet, trying this with a friend or family member or whatever and figuring out how that works on both ends of it, because we don't know until we know. And you're gonna mess it up. I mean, we're gonna mess it up. Like if I can come back a month from now and ask these questions, you'll be like, oh, I know what to do about that. It's gonna be some on-the-job training for sure. Okay, question number 6. Let's move on to category 6. Participation. It's gonna be real easy to lose participation on some of your kiddos. So how are we gonna ensure that everyone's voice is heard and that everybody is participating? So I'll give you some time to talk through that a little bit. Let's take 5 minutes and then we'll come back and discuss that together. I'm gonna say a couple of things about participation that just came to my mind during this time. One of them is, think about what you do in your classroom to make sure that everyone's participating and just alter it after virtual. You guys have lots of tools to draw in those kiddos who, like, I've got 4 kids at home. One of them would literally never say a word if someone didn't give her the confidence and put her in a position to have to do that. And so you're gonna not know that when you start the year, but it won't take you very long. So if you need to keep track somehow of who's participated, who's had something to say, who's been able to let their voice be heard, you might need to have some kind of tracking system to do that. But think about what you do in the classroom. How do I change that a little bit so that I'm making sure everyone's participating? Because you will have kids that won't. It'll be real easy for those real quiet kids to just get lost in the midst of this. Yes?
I was just gonna share one thing we've done as a district for years is teachers make the popsicle sticks. You can still use your popsicle sticks and randomly pull kids and call on them random. Or some teachers use the digital virtual wheel and they spin the wheel and it randomly calls on students. So you can still use those.
It's funny because popsicle sticks, I just haven't been in a classroom for a few years, so I was afraid to say popsicle sticks. But, we pull the popsicle sticks, or she said the wheel, whatever you use in the classroom, you probably are going to be able to use it to pull kids in virtually too. So that's important. The other thing that came to my mind that I wanted to bring up, and I don't know, there's a lot of district guidelines for how much time kids are on Zoom and all that. I don't know what yours are in Grandview. But what I can tell you is that I've done a lot of Zoom over the last 6 months. We've done almost until real recently. Like, I'm so happy to be with real people today, like just to get a little bit of feedback. It's very hard not to get the feedback when you're on Zoom, and it's exhausting. So we're gonna have to keep that in mind as we move into the school year. What is reasonable? How long is it reasonable to keep kids focused? I know you have guidelines that I don't know, but that is a thought that has to be in your head. It's different. It's different. I told my husband the other day, it's like all the things, I'm an introvert. This is more than you need to know, but I'm an extreme introvert. Why I do this job, I'm not sure. But it's like being with people. When you're on Zoom, it's like all the things that you get that exhaust you without that thing that you get from being with people, that positive stuff. So think through that when you're planning, what is reasonable for kids? Because some of them are going to get really tired from this. And your extroverts are just they're really going to struggle because they want to be with people so bad. So, okay, let's move on to category number 7. Chat responsibly. Wow. Let me just give you an example of this. I told you that I've got my 12-year-old, my youngest. I have 4 kids. My 12-year-old's going into 7th grade. She's the youngest. So when all this happened last spring and teachers were scrambling, trying to figure out what to do, that was her biggest anxiety, the chat. She was like, because she's a rule follower. Like, we'd like her to break a couple rules. I think she needs to break a couple rules. Don't tell anybody I said that, but she does need to. But she was so stressed out about what was happening in the chat. Because, 6th graders, they were just chatting about things that had nothing to do with what was going on. It was such a distraction for her. She would get off the call and every time she's like, you're not going to believe what they were chatting in the chat. And they were just being so, now, some of them thought that was real funny, but I'm telling you the other side of that is that was really distracting and very difficult for her. And so I thought, oh my goodness, now teachers have to figure out what to do with this feature that can be a great feature. Like, we have learned that it is a feature we have to have in some of our big meetings because it helps us get back on track, or it helps us repeat things that we need to repeat. But you're gonna have to think through, what are you gonna do with chat? And how are you gonna use it? And are you gonna start off using it? Or are you gonna not use it for a while and then introduce it later as a lesson, as a procedure? So take 5 minutes and talk about how to chat responsibly. Microphone off for a second. We had some really good conversations happen around that.
Okay, we are really close on time, so I need you to adhere to that, please, and come back. Okay, so I was just sharing up at the front kind of my journey. It's just my journey with chat in the spring. I had colleagues that tried to squelch all chat if it's possible. I had some that were open-ended, and I found for me the happy medium was this. Good luck on the first day of school with having kids come in if we were on site and saying to every child, do not say a word. Go into that classroom and sit in that seat. Don't say hello to anybody. Don't talk to anybody. Just sit. It wouldn't work. So apply that to the virtual setting. So my comfort zone, and this is what I was telling Lori, she has to make it work for her. My comfort zone was if we started at 9 o'clock, I've said to several of you, I opened the room at 8:45. You have from 8:45 to 9 o'clock to have a free-flowing conversation. Now, again, those kids knew my expectations on what was okay and what wasn't okay. You would have to renegotiate that with your new class. But from 8:45 to 9 o'clock, you would be amazed. I really didn't have an issue with attendance. I really didn't. They wanted to be there. They knew that I would be there. That was their time to have that social interaction. As they're coming in, I'm taking attendance. I'm having conversations with them as well, and that chat is running. Our agreement was at 9 o'clock, if we're in session, chat goes off. I had what we called a chat captain. That chat captain monitored, because I was sharing up here. I don't know what it looked like for you, but when I was teaching with the document camera, what went away? All of the kids. Because if I'm sharing my screen for you to see what I see, I can't see the students. It's like teaching in pitch black. I have no idea what's landing. And so I had to have students that I could rely on to say, Mr. Scheer, we've got a question here. And they had that ability where they could interrupt. They were the only people that could do that. If we were managing a Zoom and I'm seeing faces, it was really hard. So I had the kids make little cards. If they had a hand, they put the hand up in front of the camera. That meant they had a question. If they wanted to answer a question, they had a little mouth and they put the mouth up. Now again, I'm a former elementary teacher. I get high school English isn't going to probably look the same way, and I understand that. But I'm just saying, you have to come up with some kind of a quick system because I can't see little boxes. It was hard for me. And so I'm just throwing out things that works for me. And those are the same kinds of things that you're going to find. You're going to work in, you're going to find new expectations, new things that you hadn't thought through that in the moment, you're going to start realizing, okay, this wasn't working for me. The chat was a real concern because there is that potential for someone to publicly humiliate or shame. And you know what? Chat is a privilege. And if you can't manage that, we're going to renegotiate that right out of your contract. And I will go through you and I will go through your parent in order to do that. Because I can't prevent you from being there, but I can limit your access if I need to. And so I think, again, it's just thinking about it. Because I tell you, I went back and forth with a colleague who said, there will be no chat. I don't want to deal with it. I'm like, how do you prevent kids from wanting that interaction? You wouldn't do that on site. Good luck selling that to a parent. Your child's not allowed to talk from 9 to 4 every day. It wouldn't work. So you have to sometimes step back and think, well, what would it have looked like if I was doing this in person? And then just make that little crossover to what it might look like virtually. So.
Can you see all their faces in, like, on Zoom? Because, like, when it's only the bar across and then they hold up a card, but you can't see all of them. You have to keep
But
scrolling.
I could see their faces. I could see when again, not when I'm teaching, but when I'm looking at their faces. Not when I'm sharing the screen teaching. When I'm back on looking at faces, yeah, I can see faces. You can see faces. We're going to talk privately because we're running out of time.
Okay, let's move on to number 8. We've got 2 left, so you're not going to have a whole lot of time to think through these, but I at least want to mention them. So category 8 is communication. We need to be teaching kids how to communicate anyway in the classroom or out. What does active listening look like? What does it look like to communicate back and forth? So one of the questions on here is how we respond when a student is disruptive. When we were talking about the chat, remember, you can always take things back to it's never okay to be disruptive and it's never okay to be hurtful. Whether you are on site or you are remote, those are the bottom lines either way. So if it falls under those things, that's how you can address it. Hey, it's never okay to be hurtful. So this isn't gonna be okay. Or hey, it's never okay to be disruptive. That keeps teaching and learning from happening. So talk about communication. Number 8, I'm gonna give you 2 minutes because I wanna be done by noon, and it's almost noon. So I'll give you 2 minutes to talk about communication. Real quick, because we're about out of time. I'm not even gonna let you share right now, but what I hope is happening, I'll wait for you. What I'm hoping is going to happen is that you'll go back to your buildings and your grade levels or your team, and you'll be able to continue to think about all of this. We're kind of known for coming into a building and sprinkling a bunch of stuff and then going, bye, see you. So I hope it doesn't feel like that. I hope it feels empowering to have the questions to ask ahead of time. So one tip, I'm gonna come back here.
Yes, so one of the questions was in sharing on Zoom, if you're doing a Zoom lesson and you're sharing your screen like we're doing here, you can't see the students anymore, correct? But if you have a split monitor, if you have your laptop and another monitor, you can go to the settings and choose the split screen setting. And that allows you to see your screen and still see your students on another screen. If you don't have 2 monitors, it'll still do a split screen. You'll just have to go between the 2 images. You know, like with your 3 fingers. Okay?
Thank you. Okay. Yes?
Well, I have to say, when you work in exploring, I don't know for sure, but couldn't you, if you have, it's Apple TV and you have your screen, couldn't you display the kids on the screen and then use your laptop to talk directly or to navigate
As your second screen.
as your second screen, and then
We don't have
you,
that.
right,
True.
right. I'm saying
If
when
you have it,
did,
if you have it,
which I do.
if you have it. Okay, let's move forward because I want to get you out of here. The last category, category 9, is be respectful. And I'm going to finish up and then let you talk about this one, okay? I would tell you on be respectful, still go back to those bottom lines. Still go back to those. What does hurtful look like in a virtual world? What's never going to be okay? How are we going to treat one another? So I'll let you talk about those questions in a minute, but I'm going to say my goodbye before you do that. And so when we started this morning, I said, what's your superhero power? Here's what I just want to say. I am honored to work with educators, probably more than I ever have been in my life right now, because what you all are doing is unbelievable. The kind of thinking and learning that's going on, adult learning that's going on, that we're going to pass on to kids is like nothing I have ever seen, and I'm not that young. And it is stressful, and it is hard, but you will make it, and these kids need us to do what we're doing, and everybody else in the world really didn't do a great job with that, but educators, you just said, we got to take care of our kids. We got to figure it out, and you did it. And so bravo, thank you, thank you, thank you. From a mother to teachers, thank you. I really appreciate it. Now, you can talk about being respectful, or you can leave, or whatever they tell you you can do. Thank you.
So a question just came up, it's off. For those of you who are still online, the question came up online about what was the recommendation again about breakout rooms. So I'm going to say it one more time on video. In a classroom, if you wanted to break your kids into small groups, you would always have left them in the room, right? And where you could see them and hopefully hear them for the most part. So if you use a breakout room, it's essentially taking children out of your classroom and sending them to an empty classroom, either next door or down the hall, right? But you can't see them and you can't hear them. And so if you send children out of your room, what would you normally do in a brick and mortar situation? Why would you not send children next door? They're unsupervised, right? You can't hear them, you can't see them. And so I know a lot of our advice that we're getting from trainers, facilitators, and all of our new resources are all saying breakout rooms are an excellent feature, and they are. It's an excellent feature. But plan for them carefully. Talk with your building administration about what are some ideas, what are some ways that you can use the breakout rooms with students, if it's an available feature to you. If you do have breakout rooms, how could you use them efficiently, effectively, and responsibly?
Okay, to our Zoom members, thank you for participating today. We are going to disconnect because we just have a quick little meeting that we're not going to share with the world. We're just going to keep it private. We appreciate you listening in. I, again, at the very beginning was told it was very hard to hear. So I appreciate your being understanding that we were not letting the chat guide today. We had to follow the outcomes that were laid out for the people in the room. And so that was our response, was to not let the chat guide the discussion and to ask you to remain muted. And we do appreciate that. It wasn't because we didn't want your participation at all. It just to expedite the schedule and to get us where we were, we needed to do that. So thank you for zooming in. We'll go ahead and disconnect that now.